began, but let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the April CCTST Grand Rounds. I am Catherine Bowers from the Division of Biostats and Epi, and I'm excited to welcome Dr. Brian Nosek to speak with us today. Dr. Nosek has really been a pioneer in the open science movement, which seeks to improve rigor and reproducibility in research by making scientific research, including publications, data, samples, software, etc., accessible to everyone. Dr. Nosek is the executive director of the Center for Open Science and a professor at the University of Virginia. He received his undergraduate degree in psychology with minors in computer science and women's studies from California Polytechnic State University in '95, and a PhD in psychology from Yale. Dr. Nosek's research and applied interests are to understand why people and systems produce behaviors that are contrary to intentions and values, to develop, implement, and evaluate solutions to align practices with values, and to improve research credibility and cultures to accelerate progress. As an example of Dr. Nosek's work, he co-developed the implicit association tests, a method that advanced research in public interest and implicit bias. He has also co-founded 3 nonprofit organizations, including the Center for Open Science. And we're very excited to have him speak today. And I will turn it over to you, Dr. Nosek.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks everybody for joining today. I am going to use our time today to talk about the gap between values and practices. That is my core research interest, is just behaviorally as people, how come we sometimes do things that are contrary to our intentions and goals, misaligned with our values. But the focus for today is a practical application of that basic research interest, which is on the gap between scientific values and scientific practices, how we idealize the research process to operate versus how it actually operates, and what the system of rewards that we are constrained and advantaged by might actually sometimes align with and sometimes not with the goals that we have for what we're trying to do in research. So I'm happy to answer questions along the way if you wish to interrupt, but I also don't plan to be very long, so there is time for some discussion should there be interest afterwards. So to begin, let's talk about what are scientific values. What are the ways in which we idealize science to operate? And there are many different ways that people have conceptualized the values or core ideals of science. The one I like to start with is Robert Merton's scholarly norms. Merton was a sociologist of science, and in the 1940s and early 50s, he articulated what he saw as the core norms of what distinguished science as a way of accumulating knowledge compared to other ways we might accumulate knowledge about the world. And his first norm was communality, the open sharing of information. A research claim doesn't become credible because I say, this is what I found, just trust me. You assess its credibility based on me openly sharing. Here's the methodology that I used. Here's the data that I produced. Here's the inference that I drew from that data, so that people can wrestle with that evidence versus the just trust me counter norm. His second norm was universalism. Research is evaluated on its own merit. It's the methodology, data, and inference process itself that determines its credibility, rather than the counter norm of, oh, well, that person's famous, they must know what they're talking about, so we'll believe it. His third was disinterestedness. Researchers are motivated by knowledge and discovery, just trying to figure it out, versus the counter norm of self-interestedness. Really, the way science works is as a competition where each of us is trying to get all the grant money, although it's all disappearing these days, or all the papers, or all the awards, all the jobs. And that competitive atmosphere is what drives discovery. And then his fourth norm was organized skepticism. Researchers consider all new evidence, even against their prior work, versus the counter norm of organized dogmatism. I do my dissertation, get my findings while I'm completing my degree, and then I spend the rest of my career fending off all of the attackers, trying to protect my claims against others' claims. And while Merton didn't talk about it directly, there is another common norm or ideal of quality compared to the counter norm of quantity. Now, when you look at these as a list of potential norms. They may characterize how we've perceived science to operate as an enterprise for knowledge production in our history. But an obvious question is whether researchers themselves endorse those norms of science. That's how they think science should operate, or whether they actually endorse the counter norms as how they think science should operate. So there have been several surveys asking just that over the years. Anderson and her colleagues did a survey of NIH awardees, early career here as researchers in postdoctoral roles, mid-career are researchers that had their first R01, so average age in the early 40s in this sample. And what I'm showing here is the cumulative plot of survey responses, where in gray, it's indicating those that on average endorse the norms over the counter norms from the prior slide. So 90% of the sample, regardless of career stage, was endorsing those norms of science as how science should be. In black are those that said, no, I think science should operate by the counter norms over the norms. 2-3%, almost no one is endorsing the counter norms as how science should be. And then in the gray diagonal lines are those that are weighting these about equally. Yeah, I see both of these as relevant to how science should be. So then they said, okay, thanks for that. Don't tell me how you think science should operate. Tell me how you do your science. Do you behave according to the norms or do you behave according to the counter norms? And this is their responses. So still 60 to 70% of respondents are saying that they behave according to the norms of science over the counter norms. And still very few say they behave according to the counter norms, but you can see an increasing proportion of people saying, yeah, both of these things are influencing my everyday behavior. So they say, okay, that's great. That's great. Don't tell me what you do. Tell me what all those other people in your field, what do they do? And this is what it looks like. So this data is an operationalization of a dysfunctional research culture. At the top, almost everyone endorses those norms over the counter norms. In the middle, most people say they're behaving according to those norms, although they're acknowledging some pressure from those counter norms. And those same respondents perceive that nobody else in their communities, or fewer in their communities, are behaving according to the norms. Instead, people are being driven by those counter norms of competition, secrecy, trying to advance dogmatically their own approach rather than for the collective good. So a core interest of how do we both assess research cultures and how do we improve them is to think about the ideals that we come to the disciplines we are in, the activities we do, and how those cultures are actually structured and rewarded and operate. And a functional culture will have those aligned. So we should see if most people endorse X, Y, and Z, then the culture should demonstrate X, Y, and Z. And people perceive that the culture is rewarding them for doing X, Y, and Z. So what are the factors that are creating this gap in the research culture? Well, there are many different things that we could identify easily off the top of our heads of how the ideals of science are not necessarily present all of the time in everyday research practice. And there's a lot of literature in sort of wrestling with the areas of challenge and dysfunction in the research culture. For us, we've narrowed down to what we see as a core challenge that is particularly about the credibility and advancement of research itself. And that is the incentives for my success as a researcher are focused on me getting it published, not on me getting it right. Of course, I want to get it right. I didn't get into science to write papers or spend 40% of my time writing grant proposals. Nobody got into science for that. But I recognize that those are the things that are concrete and actionable for advancing my career. I need to get papers. Papers are the currency of advancement. And so because of that, the factors that lead to publication can come to dominate over the factors that lead to credible reporting on credible findings if they're not directly rewarded. And we know that not everything gets published. I'm more likely to get published finding a positive result rather than a negative result. Right? This intervention did have an impact on that outcome. These variables are related to one another. is a more interesting, exciting, potentially advancing observation in many cases than, well, that intervention was a good idea, it didn't work, or those variables don't turn out to be related after all. I'm more likely to get published if I find something new and novel rather than gathering additional evidence of prior claims because it's pushing the boundaries out. That's, again, seems more exciting, more impactful. And I'm more likely to get published if my findings are neat and tidy and reinforce my claims based on the evidence that I have, rather than have things that exceptions and things that don't quite fit and things that I don't quite understand yet. So a novel, positive, tidy story is both the most publishable kind of story, and it's also the most amazing thing that we can contribute in science, right? If you find something new, it actually has some directional advance in the world, and all of your evidence supports your basic theoretical claims. That's an amazing contribution. But of course, that doesn't happen very often. And it certainly doesn't happen at the cadence of a paper by paper by paper reward system. That kind of understanding, where you've accumulated evidence, advanced a new idea, and provided a coherent theoretical explanation for it, occurs across many people over many years and takes time to come together. And so we face a challenge where the reward system, being paper by paper, is misaligned with the process of actual discovery. And that creates a conflict of interest for me as an active researcher, which is because I need to get certain kinds of outcomes, but my research isn't always aligned with those outcomes, I have opportunity to make adjustments, lots of discretion in the research process that may lead me to create things that are more publishable, not intending for them to be inaccurate, but because of that reward system, I may rationalize decisions in the research process that undermine the credibility of my findings in favor of their publishability. So I want to unpack this in terms of its consequences for the research enterprise, and then spend the latter part of the session talking about the consequences. So those incentives for novel, positive, tidy outcomes might have several impacts. So they may, for example, encourage, in subtle ways, selective reporting. I do 20 experiments a semester in my lab. A subset of those provide positive evidence for novel claims, maybe just a few. I may rationalize to myself very easily that those other ones where I got negative results or messy things were just bad studies. I don't know why I did that study that way. That was a ridiculous thing to do, and reason that they aren't things to include in my papers. When I'm doing research and I'm analyzing my data, there are several choice points that are reasonable choice points for deciding exclusion rules, for what model form to use, for what covariates to include in the model. And those choices can have consequences for the outcome. And if those outcomes vary based on all of those analytic decisions or process decisions as I'm doing the research, then I may again have opportunity to rationalize to myself that the analysis approach that leads to the best outcome is in fact the right outcome, the right way to analyze the data, rather than recognizing that the a priori decisions leading to the outcome, whatever it is. That will lead to exaggerated findings that are less credible than if I had followed a proposed plan. Because the reward system is about the outcomes, there isn't really much reason for me to be transparent in my research process or to share the components of my research as I do it or what I have produced. And so it's harder then for you to be able to evaluate what it is I did and how I did it. And if it's really about novelty that is the core basis of reward, then once I have a finding, something new that could be advancing the field and advancing my career, then conducting a replication of my own finding is not in my interest because all I could do is lose that finding that I could publish. Likewise, if I see something that you did that's interesting, it's not really in my interest to try to replicate and verify it because I'm not going to get rewarded for that. I need to push out the boundaries of my own new discoveries in order to really advance my career. Now, if those practices are influencing my day-to-day behavior in terms of conducting and reporting of my own research, then those have consequences at scale if many people are influenced by those same factors. When we have selective reporting, we're only reporting the positive outcomes. When those outcomes are manufactured by making different choices in the analytic and reporting pipeline, and without any sharing of the information, the literature as a whole is going to become less credible because it's a selective report of what actually happened in the research process. And without that transparency or sharing, and without ordinary verification processes like replication being conducted and valued, then we reduce the presence of the self-corrective processes that are core to how we understand science to make advances. We don't expect every discovery to be true. In fact, we know most of them are going to hit dead ends. They're going to be much more qualified than the initial evidence suggested. That's all fine. That's part of discovery, right? We're pushing the boundaries of knowledge. We're reaching out into unlikely and unknown domains. And so lots of false starts is part of that process. But those false starts need to be cleaned up in the system. The self-corrective process of science depends on being able to actually conduct verification research of those initial discoveries, of clear sharing of how it is I got to those claims that I provide, so that you can challenge the methodology, you can extend the methodology, you can do it again and see if you observe similar evidence and otherwise. And without that, how does correction happen? And with both a challenge to the credibility of the published literature and a weakness in the self-corrective process, then we just produce waste. It's not that we aren't making progress. Tons of progress is happening in science with enormous investment. And we could accelerate that progress if we address some of the factors that create some dysfunction in the reward system that don't need to be there in how it is they produce the quality and credibility of the research findings. So there is a lot of meta-science research looking at the various factors in this simplified model. And the converging evidence across many different fields is that the research literature itself is challenged in terms of its credibility, and sometimes in surprising ways. So, for example, we have conducted systematic replication studies, take a sample of findings from different literatures and subject them to replication, where we try to do them again independently. And across the various times that we've tried this, here are examples from psychology and preclinical cancer biology research. The replication studies show weaker evidence than the published finding, which is what you would anticipate based on these factors that could be influencing reporting of research and selective reporting, and then questionable practices as they occur. This is just illustration of many different types of areas of evidence of the credibility of findings in the literature as it exists, perhaps not being as strong as just assuming published is synonymous with true. So that's the basic problem statement as we conceive of where the research culture is creating a dysfunctional reward system and how that reward system may play out in reducing and impacting directly the credibility of the findings that we produce and slowing the progress of research advancement. So I want to spend the rest of my time on highlighting solutions to that problem. And again, I'll keep this brief so that we have more time for discussion. But the items that I want to focus on are these, and I'll talk directly about how these types of solutions alter that reward system and those consequences that I was just walking through. So, for example, the notion of sharing data, sharing materials, sharing code. So the products of the research, right? David Donahoe from Stanford likes to call the paper advertising for the research, not research itself. It's really the methodology that you used, the materials, the artifacts that you generated in the research process. That is the research. And my paper writing is just my blinkered characterization of what I think I did and how I think I did it and what I think is important to tell you as a reader to understand it. But if all of those materials were shared so that you could critically evaluate them You might identify things that I didn't recognize or notice in my process. You might take that data, reanalyze it in different ways to see if my findings are robust to the choices that I make in my analytic pipeline. Or you might take the materials and methods and conduct the research yourself again, or extend it in different ways to see that I was overclaiming and making a very broad conclusion where it's really actually a very narrow conclusion that's possible with this. It only occurs under the very specific circumstances that were in my experimental setup. So that data sharing and transparency enables the self-corrective processes, which should reduce overall waste in research. Likewise, just promoting replication studies, providing reward, providing avenues to publish them, providing funding to conduct them is another mechanism for just facilitating that self-corrective process. If we don't see it as rewarded at all, it will be hard to prioritize conducting replications. And so they won't get done, even under occasions where we might see them as being of value. The other side does not get addressed simply by transparency of the products as I produce them, because they're about the choice points that I make as I'm deciding what research to do and whether to report it and how to do it in the process. And so the interventions on the left side here, the primary mechanism to address them is pre-registration. In a pre-registration, I document before completing the experiment that the experiment exists and what my analysis strategy is for testing the questions that I specified in that experiment. And by just documenting that the experiment exists, you as a reader can in principle discover when I selectively report. So I do 20 experiments, only put 4 in the paper. Because the registry has all 20 documented that I did them, you can reasonably ask, well, what happened to those other 16? And I can, oh, well, they were not really well done, and I don't think you should pay attention to those. And I might be right, but you can at least evaluate whether I'm right and understand the implications of the fact that I made some selection decisions of what evidence gets reported relevant to that. If I document my analysis plan from the outset, then that makes much clearer whether I'm employing questionable research practices, whether I am looking at the data and changing my analysis strategy based on what I'm observing in the data, thereby increasing the likelihood of false positive results, or whether I'm following the plan as I specified it in advance. And this type of approach does not value confirmatory plan testing over exploratory discovery. It just makes really clear to you and to me which one I'm doing, because both discovery-oriented data interactive types of analyses and data-independent decisions to test my hypotheses against data are really important parts of research advancement. But if I am in that interaction with data discovery process and come to the end with some findings, it's so easy for me to misremember and say, oh, of course, this is what I would have expected. And of course, my theory anticipates this particular combination of findings. And so I'll just write my paper as if this was my plan all along, thereby misrepresenting the actual discovery process and making it seem like I was testing hypotheses when I was really generating them interactively with the data, providing false confidence in their certainty. So pre-registration helps to clarify those things that are actually a priori versus those things that are post facto. And so I can report to you, yeah, I analyzed the data 50 different ways and this thing popped out. And you and I can calibrate our confidence in that and say, oh, well, that's super interesting, but I want to see it again before I take that seriously. Okay, last one goes after the key origin incentive. So with all of these different solutions, there is still the driving incentive for novel, positive, tidy outcomes. It's an outcomes-based reward system because we write our papers and we submit them when we're done. Here's what I found. Here's what I learned. And then the decision is based on, is that exciting, interesting? Does that deserve to be in this journal? The last intervention tries to go directly at that incentive and change it from an outcomes-based incentive to a quality-based one. And this is the publishing model of registered reports. So in case this is unfamiliar, I want to unpack this one some just to share how it is we think about really trying to shift the reward systems with some tweaks in how it is we do the research process itself. So this is a cartoon version of how research gets done, right? We design a study, we collect and analyze the data, we write the report, and we publish it. But of course, it's not that simple because there's this peer review barrier between I've written the report and I'm trying to get it published. And that barrier is the impediment to me getting the reward that I need. And so I need to do what I can do in the report authoring to make it so one of those sets of peer reviewers at one of those journals I eventually submit it to eventually says, okay, fine, and lets it through to publication. The registered report model makes one key change to this process, and that is it moves the first stage of peer review to after the design phase. So as an author, what I do if I'm submitting a registered report to a journal is I write the background, the motivation for the research questions, some exploratory research. Here's some things that we were doing in the lab that popped out and I'm surprised by them, but we think this gave us an idea of what we think might be going on. And then here is the methodology of the experiments that I'm going to do to test the question that I'm about to test. And the reviewers evaluate that. And what they evaluate is this an important question? And is this an effective test of that question or questions? And if it passes the bar for those criteria, then the journal makes an in-principle commitment. We will publish this regardless of outcome as long as you do what you said you were going to do. That in-principle commitment, based on the methodology without knowing what the outcomes are, eliminates, in principle, any bias of what the outcomes actually are because no one knows what they are. So what changes for me in submitting a registered report is that instead of chasing exciting outcomes, I am rewarded for asking important questions and designing really effective methods to test those questions. And then I get my in-principle commitment for publication. I go and do the work. And then when the journal gets the report back and the reviewers look at it again, they do not evaluate, did I get what I thought I was going to get? Was my hypothesis correct? Are the findings interesting? All of that is put aside. And their evaluation is, did you follow through with what you said you were going to do? And did you interpret the results, whatever they are, responsibly? And if it meets those basic criteria, then it gets published, regardless of outcome. So this model, the first journal, I did a special issue in 2014, the journal in my field, social psychology, that was all registered reports, just to proof of concept that this could be done. And since then, 2014, there are now something like 350 journals or more that offer registered reports as an option for publishing. And it has been embraced by many of the most visible journals, Nature and many of the Nature named journals, for example, or multiple named journals, offer registered reports as a publishing option. It is most prominent in the social behavioral sciences where it emerged, but is available in any discipline for some journals, and increasingly prevalent in biomedical sciences. So I want to give a bit of evidence about it, given that it is core to some of these challenges for how the reward system is shaped. So Anne Scheel and her colleagues took some of the early registered reports and identified a comparison sample of articles published in the same journals, same fields, around the same time as those registered reports. And then they looked at the papers and they went to the first question hypothesis in the paper and evaluated whether it was supported or not by the evidence reported. What they see in the standard model, right, the way we do research and get submitted for peer review, is that 95% of the hypotheses in the paper were supported by the evidence. 95%. Wow, why do we even do the research if we're always right? We could just say, here's my hypothesis, and we can know pretty confidently that we must be right if the standard literature is right 95% of the time. And that's laughable because we know that's not how it actually is, right? We know that we're not right that frequent of the time. We know that we're wrong most of the time, but our literature implies that we are right that amount of time. Because in the registered reports model, where no one knows what the results are when the commitment is made to publication, they observed that that first hypothesis was supported 40% of the time. So that contrast between 95 and 40% is selective reporting right there. We remove it by removing outcomes-based assessment, and suddenly all of that stuff that otherwise wouldn't appear in the literature is appearing in the literature. Okay, so that's one strand of evidence suggesting that this model is effective at its core proposition, which is to eliminate bias against null results or publication bias more generally. We did a follow-up investigation where we essentially took a sample of registered reports and then identified comparison papers, but two samples of comparison papers, one of by the same authors but published in the standard way, and another on the same topic published in the same journal around the same time. And then we put those papers through a structured peer review process again. So these are all published papers. And what we did in that structured review process was we gave people these papers in pieces and had them evaluate it, but with a more structured format than the open-ended qualitative peer review style. So they had to answer specific questions and provide ratings on a number of dimensions for the registered reports and for the comparison articles. And what you're seeing here is in the dotted vertical line is performance being equivalent between the registered report and the comparison articles. Anything to the right of the dotted line is occasions where the estimate suggests that registered reports outperformed the comparison articles. And anything to the left of that dotted line are cases where the comparison articles, standard articles, outperformed the registered reports. The estimate is the biggest part of the dot, and you can see the distributions are 95% credible intervals as a Bayesian analysis. So you can see in this first part of it that this is where the reviewers read the paper up until the results section. So they've read the background, the motivation, all the introductory materials, initial experiments, if there were any initial studies, and then the methodology of the critical experiment in these papers. And then they were asked to evaluate what's the rigor of the methods, what's the quality of the methods, how much will we learn from this research, what's the quality of the question, et cetera, down this list. And you can see that every estimate from strong to weak but positive showed that the registered reports outperformed the comparison articles, even on things like the novelty of the question and creativity of the methods. Then we gave them the results section and the discussion of those results. And we had them evaluate the subsequent items here. The rigor of the analysis, whether the conclusions were justified, the quality of the results, the quality of the discussion, et cetera. And again, you can see the registered reports outperform the comparison articles on every single dimension from strong to modest. And what's remarkable here to me is that the amount we learned, the innovativeness of the results, and the importance of the findings are all favoring the registered report over the comparison articles. And that's despite the fact that registered reports are much more likely to report null results. So a common reason that editors and active researchers will say that they don't report null results is because no one cares about them. We don't learn anything from them. They're not useful. And in this context, we are seeing exactly the opposite sort of evidence, that the registered report model, at least in this sample, is showing that people perceive greater learning and more innovation from those results, regardless of outcome. So there's lots we could speculate for why it is that occurs. My speculation is that if we have to make our publication decision based on only knowing the question and the methods, then what we're assessing effectively is, do we need to know the answer to this question? And if the answer to that is yes, not knowing what the answer is, then any answer is important, not just the answer coming out one way. So registered reports may be more likely to end up being designed so that all outcomes are informative outcomes and perceived as useful outcomes for advancing knowledge and new directions. Now, we don't have direct evidence of that, but that is my, just as an experiential actor in this space, that's my perception of why that might be occurring. Then we give them all the rest of the information about the paper, and we have them evaluate the paper as a whole down here at the bottom. And you can see on those general criteria as well, the registered reports outperformed the comparison articles. This itself is one paper. It's one set of findings. We need to see how far this will go, especially as adoption broadens for the registered reports model. But what it suggests to me is the possibility that by shifting the way in which we decide what should be published, we change fundamentally, potentially, the quality of the content of what we ultimately publish. By changing it from me saying, God, I just need to make sure that my outcomes are exciting enough to get the reviewer's interest, to I need to make sure my methods and questions are exciting and high quality enough to get through the reviewers, we change potentially, fundamentally, the quality of the evidence that we're ultimately providing and producing. Now, there's a lot more we should talk about in this, so I hope there'll be lots of different questions because I don't see it as a panacea for all kinds of research, but I think we are still at the early stage of seeing the potential of these models to complement other ways of doing and reporting research. So I just want to close with evidence of a changing environment toward open science. All of the things that I've been talking about are part of the initiatives and practices being promoted in this cultural discussion about how can we improve our transparency, our rigor, our reproducibility. And we see a dramatic shift in behavior across disciplines, some disciplines more than others, for adoption of open behaviors. For example, papers mentioning generalist repositories, repositories that make it easy to share data or code or other materials. If we just look at mentions of those repositories in papers over time, this needs to be updated through 2022. The growth has been dramatic across a variety of different solutions. On the idea of pre-registration, some of these types of repositories allow for pre-registration of your designs. The Y dimension is only a tenth of the size, so data sharing has dramatically increased over the last decade. Pre-registration has also increased dramatically, but at a 1/10 scale. But you can see the growth of people noting in their papers that there is a pre-registration and identifying repository associated with that. So this is becoming a lot more common. But that growth is being accelerated by a variety of different actions, by journals, by funders, by grassroots movements for social change, by institutions a little. But really, a system that to shift a system culturally, we have to recognize that each individual researcher is embedded in a social system that engages the institution in which they are employed and with a system of rewards for who gets a job and who advances in their career. In the system of rewards of publication, which journals do they try to publish in and how do those, what are their policies? The funders that fund their work and what the expectations are of grantees to get the grant and to complete the grant. And then the societies that set the norms and standards for what does it mean to do good research in this field. And to address all of the rewards from all of those different actors that are all themselves decentralized across many institutions, many publishers, many journals, many funders, is a very difficult coordination problem. And so a big part of the open science movement is how is it that we can address that coordination problem and get alignment between how it is different parts of the system are setting up and making rewards that really are promoting transparency and rigor and reproducibility, and not creating conflicts between what the funder expects of me and what my institution expects of me, which just would further challenge researchers to be successful and effective in those environments. I'll just call out one simple example separate from the types of things that I've been discussing now in institutional culture. When I went up for full professor now more years ago than I want to count, I had to submit to my administrator. She said, okay, the way we do the review for promotion is you have to print out all your papers and give them to the committee. I print out all my papers. Like, what are you talking about? This is print them. Like, you crazy? Yeah, we print them as a requirement. And I said, all the papers? They said, yeah, all the papers. Now this is for full professor. So I had 100 papers at that point. Said the committee wants 100 papers. Yes, that's our requirement. I said, what are they going to do? Weigh them? Like, that's a ridiculous request. They are not going to read 100 papers. I've barely read all of my papers. They are not going to read these papers. What they did in what seems like just an administrative decision for implementing a policy was they implemented the idea that quantity is what matters. Right. So if I'm going for tenure, I have to send you all my papers. Oh my God, I'm going to make sure I have a lot of papers to really impress that committee. What they could have done is when I walked in the door, they could have said, you're going to go up for promotion 6 years from now. Don't worry about it. But what we want you to know, what's happening when you go up 6 years from now. You're going to submit to the committee 3 papers. You get to pick which ones. Pick your best 3 papers, and we're going to read them, and we're going to send them out to the external reviewers, and they're going to read them too. We're going to ask them for feedback because they're real, domain experts that will ask about those papers. So make sure you have 3 really good ones. You probably want to do more because, you never know how research goes and everything else. But make sure your winners are real winners. If I had that as what it means to succeed, I would have oriented very differently to how it is I advance my research at my institution, because I wouldn't have thought I just need to salami slice this and do as many pieces as possible. But instead, I need to focus on quality because that's actually what they're going to evaluate me on, and they're going to read it. So I see there's several very simple little changes that we can think about in terms of how we set up our evaluation systems to be better aligned with the outcomes that we're trying to achieve in research process and the things that we want to reward ourselves and our colleagues for, so that we maximize the quality and the progress of the work that we do. So with that, I'm going to end so that we have a little bit of time for questions if there are any. And I'll just point you to different places you can get more information about our work. We operate the Open Science Framework, free open infrastructure for you to do all of these open science practices. There are more than 800,000 users of that now. So if you're not yet one, please feel free to join it, use it with your teams. There are several other types of initiatives like the registered reports intervention that we're testing out and trying to see if these will help promote and evolve that reward system so that we can be doing the work the way that we got into science to do in the first place and get rewarded for it. And if you'd like these slides, there's the link at the end. So thanks very much, everybody, for making the time today. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much. And we do have a couple questions in the chat, and I was just wondering if the questioners would actually pop off mute so you can ask your questions and have it be more of a discussion. Michael Seid, if you are available, would you mind asking your question?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I have to be off camera, so I'm sorry, but
no worries.
It was very, very provocative and interesting talk. Thank you very much. This is really resonates with the experience of myself and I'm sure others. The question I had was just a methods question on the study that people were rating the registered reports versus the others. The reviewers were blinded as to the status of their reports. Yes.
Well, partly yes.
Okay.
So we removed all mentions of registered report from it. However, it is not so hard to detect, right? Because the orientation to how you write these things is different. So this is a very important point to raise because it's a relevant caution for you can't really hide something that's about the method in describing the methods. And the fact that they had to pre-commit to some of these things bleeds out in how it is that a lot of these papers are written. So we asked reviewers to we told them afterwards, one of these was a registered report, which means this. One of these was not a registered report, which means normal. Can you tell us which one was which? Because they got them in pairs. And they were above chance in identifying which one was which. But we see the same effects even if they did not accurately recognize that. Having been a researcher about implicit bias, I still think that probably they detected some things. So there is some awareness there that can be impacting the results. Simultaneously, being aware that random assignment was done effectively is also something that's relevant for evaluating the quality of research. So it's sort of there's a philosophical question of how much do you want it blinded, but how much does it need to be blinded to get an honest test of such a question?
Right. No, that's the exact point, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Thank you.
exactly. So we kind of want it both ways. We want people that don't really understand it, but just sort of pick up the vibes of everything else and see
Turns
how
out
they
science is
evaluate it.
hard.
Yeah. Dang it. Dang it. If only this was easy. So yeah, thank you for that question, Michael. Really appreciate it.
And Jonelle, are you also still available to ask your question? I can read it if not.
Hi, yeah, I'm available.
Thanks.
Um, yeah, um, like Michael said, thank you so much for this talk. It's very, very interesting. I have not engaged in this style of submission or publication before, and so I'm just not really sure what the timing looks like. And I was wondering if you could speak to that kind of relative to IRB, grants, whatever.
Yes, great question. There are several pathways to this. So a default one is you have your grants, you've been doing, your IRB is conducted totally separately, and you're just going through your work process, and you get to a point where you're like, you know what, I think we kind of have something here. And here's the next experiment we want to do to really see if we've got it. Let's write a registered report right now. And so you do that, you write up your exploratory work that you've been doing, and then you write up that key study or studies that you want to propose. And then they are evaluated. But the other pathways that you might be anticipating are things like, well, gosh, a lot of this sounds like grant writing in the first place. So are there ways that we might be able to actually do something even more innovative here? And we have been doing some pilots of partnering a funder and a journal or multiple journals together for a single review process. So we've been doing this in consciousness research recently in neuroscience, where we offer grants and to apply for the grant, you write a registered report and you submit it to a journal. And the journal receives that evaluation and a budget that's within the parameters of what we can pay. And if it makes it through the peer review process and they say we're committed to publishing it, then you get the commitment to publication and you get the money to do the research. And it's a single review process. Everybody loves this, right? Authors say, wait, I submit one time and I get the money and I get the publication. Okay, sign me up. The journals say, oh, so you're going to make sure that high quality funded research is coming to my journal? Sign us up. And funders say, wait, so everything that we fund will get published? It's not that 70% of the things that we funded go into the file drawer and never seen by anybody? Okay, sign us up. So there are ways to sort of make a win-win-win with some of these types of changes that really to help sort of align what for me as the active researcher says, great, I get all the things that I need to be able to do my work, and the others to actually get a win out of it at the same time. So thanks for raising that.
Sure. May I ask one other question?
Yeah.
Thanks. I am also really curious in terms of like qualitative or mixed method studies, especially sequential designs where there's like multiple phases. What does it look
Yeah.
like outside of like the randomized controlled clinical trial?
Yeah, great question. So there are a few different ways that this is played out. And a lot of this is still in the innovation space because this is, and we've been doing it for a decade, and simultaneously it's sort of pushing the boundaries as it enters into new disciplines. The easy place to start was basic laboratory experimentation, right? You plan a study, you do the study, it doesn't take too long, you write it up. And the more complicated cases were, okay, this is a longitudinal investigation. Wait a sec, I'm not going to write a registered report before year one, and this is a 10-year, like, what? That doesn't make any sense. And existing data, so secondary data analysis types of domains, and qualitative domains. I just last year edited my first qualitative registered report, and it was a great process because it just what could be pre-registered in that qualitative context required some back and forth between the authors and the reviewers. But everybody was sort of puzzling together, like how might we think about this in terms of what commitments you need to make? Because it was an interview context, right? They were doing a structured set of interviews. But the interviews by design would be evolving a little bit, right? The initial set of review interviews might inform what happens next. So basically, they landed on what is it that could be pre-specified. We agree that if you do that, you'll learn something interesting. And so we'll publish that as long as you do it responsibly. So it was a great experience, but it also does not yet have the systematic structure that just experimentation sort of lands on easily. In those other environments, like you're doing a set of experiments, some register report tests at some journals have done sort of serial review. So do your first experiment, see the outcome. Oh, yeah, that was interesting. Now propose your second one. We'll review that and then do it. And oh, a third one, review that, and then we'll do it. So they're interesting tests for pushing the boundaries. How far can we go with these sorts of designs? So thanks for raising that.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And Maurizio, I see you have your hand up as well. You have a question.
Yes, if I can unmute myself. Oh, okay.
I can hear you.
Yeah, good. Hi. Well, first of all, hats off. Your undertaking is impressive and actually gives hope that maybe we can fix this system.
Right.
But I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. One is there any evidence that, in fact, the traction of the papers that have pre-registration is in terms of citation index, some impact in the literature is actually moving in the right direction?
Yeah, great one to raise because a lot of editors, when we're talking to them about register reports, they say, oh, that's super cool in principle, but I'm not going to be the editor that tanks our impact factor by adopting this because no one will ever cite negative results.
Right.
And so there is evidence. There are 3 or 4 different papers now that have looked at the impact on regular citation metrics and alternative metrics, news mentions and otherwise. The distribution, if I'm characterizing right in vote counting terms, is one finds more impact by registered reports, one finds less impact, and the other 2 find no difference. So it's still an open question to oversimplify the evidence. But my bet is that there isn't much difference at all, that the distributions are very similar. And it goes back to that earlier point that I made about what the registered report model really does, which is it sort of puts the reviewer and the author in that, and the editor for that matter, in the position of saying, do we need, the answer to this? And if any evidence really is useful evidence, then they will get cited. to the extent that the question was an interesting question, even when it's a negative result. So some of the other things that we see with registered reports that increase, I think, their impact compared to other things that might be negative results is that there is a higher demand on more sensitive, higher power designs. Because if you're going to make a commitment, we're going to publish this regardless of outcome, then doing a super underpowered study with imprecise measurement, people are like that's not really going to come out. Like we're not going to be able to conclude anything. And so we can't commit to publishing it. And they say, well, we can double the sample size. Okay, now I'm interested. That'll be a precise. So there's some evolution happening in how the research is getting evaluated and what sort of the barriers are to getting through to publication.
Yeah, to me, honestly, it's already encouraging that they may be at par with the non-registered report,
Totally agree.
given the distribution that you have shown of inconsistency with the initial hypothesis.
Right. Exactly.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So,
I think it's very encouraging.
the other question is there any traction in the federal government? I mean, now it's going to be impossible, but yeah, to incorporate this concept in the funding process, because you're moving the peer review to the design stage is very similar to what should be happening in the grant review process, right?
Yes, great question. So the funders that we have partnered with to do this in pilots in different fields have all been private funders. So Arnold Ventures funded one of these. The Templeton World Charity Foundation funded one that is still active right now in consciousness research. We're doing that right now. And then we have some related ones that are partnerships with like private companies. So Meta, we have partnered with running a registered reports model for access to Instagram data to test questions about social well-being in adolescents using social media. This is obviously an area of lots of challenge for Meta, and they perceived it in their interest to try to proactively demonstrate that they could share data in a responsible way with researchers that are independently asking questions of that data without to address some of the risks that they have in business interest wise against some of the critiques that are happening of them not being amenable to sharing data for potential things that would undermine their organization. So that is an interesting test case where we're not providing grant funding, but we're providing very valuable data access that we mediate. So the researchers go through the registered report process. It's all independently reviewed by academic editors. And then we mediate the access to the data for those registered reports that get approved. And then they get the access to the data and can conduct their research. So there's lots of potential ways in which this gets implemented. I went kind of on a sidetrack from your question in terms of federal government. There's actually this may be one of the positive opportunities in the current climate. There are very few positive things to say about how science is being affected in this administration. Actually, there's almost none. So here's one, which is there is interest in replication. Now, of course, that interest, the way that it's playing out right now, is vengeful interest. I'm interested in replicating the RFK says the relationship between vaccines and autism. Okay, that's not worth our time. We know what the outcome would be. We have plenty of evidence about it. And the only thing that might happen is sort of weaponizing replication in a way that's poorly done in order to get the outcome that one wants. For us, the registered reports model is a fix for these sorts of ideological contexts where people have points of view that they are trying to advance for whatever reason. What the registered reports model can do is to get pre-commitment, not just from the authors, the ones doing the research, but also the evaluators. So an example of this in a federal context, a group called the Lab at DC is a sort of a social experimental lab that was operating in the District of Columbia office. And they organized what is effectively a registered report about the effectiveness of police body cameras. This was several years ago now. And they did it as using this registered report model, really more of a pre-registration model, but they did it by bringing in together different people in the community that had very different beliefs about whether body cameras on police was a good or a bad idea. And they got everyone to agree on a design of the study, on the primary outcomes, on what those endpoints would be, and what would be reported. And by doing that before anybody could see the data, it was hard to impose ideological points of view. Of course, there's lots of ideology and methods, but nobody had the advantage of being able to reason backwards from the data to how the design should be. And they didn't get everybody on board. Everybody say, oh, well, I guess I was wrong with the outcome. People were still ideological after the fact, but you could see it. And you could use that as a mechanism for trying to address some of that ideological tangle that was happening. So our optimistic, sorry, I'm babbling on this. Our optimistic hope is that we might be able to get some of these methods introduced in these stronger ideological contexts as a counterweight to the ideological positioning. So thanks for raising that and giving me a chance to go off on a tangent.
Thank you for giving an encouraging talk these days.
All right, well, we've reached the end of time. So thank you again so much for the talk. Thank you for staying an extra few minutes to finish answering all the questions. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thanks, everybody, for coming.